Great, we're alive. All right, everybody. Welcome everybody to another Quadrilogue. Thank you all who signed up for this, and we hope you're excited. I definitely am for this conversation. Today's conversation is oriented to really trying to exemplify the kind of research and refinement process that TIAMAT has gone through and still is continuing to go through in its development, and even as we bring programs to you guys. So that's why my guests today are a particular mix. We have Naz, who is training as a facilitator at the moment. There's John Vervaeke, who most of you will know, who has been highly influential in the development of TIAMAT, but has yet to take the full program, even though we have a lot of convergent practices, and I've learned a lot from John and implemented a lot of that work. And then we have Sarabinh, whom I've been in a lot of conversation with, Ellie as well, but who has not yet done TIAMAT at all. So nonetheless, they are all experts in their respective fields, and this ensures that there is a strong diversity of perspectives, and then helps to mitigate any bias that I might bring into it out of protectiveness or a sense of attachment to my own work. As an artist, that plagues me. So I need to be in good conversation with people who know their stuff to tell me what's what. Now, as you know, we've recently launched an 8-month training program called TIAMAT Act, in collaboration with the lectern, which I run with John. And there is no shortage of programs like this out there aimed at transformation. And so this conversation is really around the question of, do we actually know what transformation means? What are we trying to point at? What are we trying to invoke when we use the word transformation? Specifically, spiritual transformation. So what I'd like us to do today is kind of to use TIAMAT as a foil to like deconstruct and examine what we mean by transformation, which will help me to be clearer in terms of setting context for folks who are coming into the container. And then hopefully explicate some questions, pitfalls, risks, benefits, trade-offs that we might see when it comes to spiritual transformation. What does that mean for us culturally? What does that mean for us cognitively? What does that mean for us, well, spiritually? Right. So before we begin, I'd just like to invite each of you to introduce yourselves to folks who might not be familiar with you or your work. Have at it, guys.
I'll go first. I'm John Vervaeke. I'm a professor of cognitive psychology, cognitive science at the University of Toronto. I am also the steward, the main lecturer on the lectern, where I teach online courses. I also have a YouTube channel on Spotify where I talk to various people. Some of these are lecterns where I'm talking to other people who are teachers, and we have usually a series, or what are called Silk Road seminars, when I talk to people who represent what I'm trying to achieve with the Philosophical Silk Road Project, which is a large, comprehensive pilgrimage that I'm going on, interfaith, interphilosophical pilgrimage, to try and understand better what we need to do to address the meaning crisis by reorienting to a new advent of the sacred, a new way in which the sacred seems to be coming together and drawing together around the world. An increasing number of people are reporting this to me, and so I'm trying to be responsive to it. That's who I am.
I can take the floor from there if, yes, okay. Great. It was really lovely to be here, first of all. Thanks, Ethan, for the invitation as well. To give people an idea of my background, so currently I hold, I'm an assistant professor in artificial intelligence at the university in Nijmegen, named the Radboud University here, and within a brain sciences institute called the Donders Institute. So my daily work is kind of research around the space really between neuroscience and AI. My background, actually, I have a bit of a religious tradition as a background as well. So I'm curious how much that might come in, probably personal anecdotes. I hope personal anecdotes will be welcome. I'm sure that they will be. And then within the context of this call as well, I'm training to be a facilitator with Ethan for the TIAMAT program. and I've participated in the first, second, and third tiers of TIAMAT with Ethan and a cohort of other practitioners over the last, I guess, 2.5 years or so. Yeah, so that's me. Yeah.
I'm Sarabinh. Ethan, first of all, it's just a delight to be here this morning with you guys, early as it is for me and John, at least. And wonderful, John, to be here with you and see you again. It's been
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, and Naz, whom I don't know as well, lovely to have a chance to meet you and think with you this morning, which maybe that's my segue into my introduction, which I would say that one thing that I am is someone who really delights in thinking with other people, and in particular, thinking with other people about education and transformation, and thinking and exploring how we move into these spaces intentionally and with power, and hopefully with some responsibility and care and compassion for the kind of work we're doing and the kind of work that we're called to do. So my background really, I suppose, could be summed up in the word educator, which is to say I've been a classroom teacher from secondary school through graduate school over the years. My academic background is in the study of religion, the intersection of theology and philosophy. And I work significantly now as someone who thinks about this exact question: what is transformation and how do we cultivate it in groups of people who are in pursuit of transformation, but in different domains. So I work significantly as a consultant and as a coach with teachers and with people who are designing pedagogical programs, educational programs. Sometimes that's in schools, sometimes it's workshops. Increasingly, I've been doing some work with people who are trying to figure out how to really open up the space of communal understanding and transformation for non-dual pedagogies in Western contexts, which have particular challenges. With that in mind, much of my practice world now unfolds in the context of a Zen community, but I've also had the wonderful delight over the past years of learning from and collaborating with the Vervaeke Foundation and the spin-offs and its fellow, I suppose, practitioner enthusiasts in the dialectic into dialogos pathway, and have incorporated some of that into my own work with teachers and learners in different areas. And it's really, as I said in the beginning, like just a wonderful way to start a Saturday. So thank you, Ethan.
Yeah, I want to just sort of echo that. Like, thank you all for joining me. I know it's particularly early, Sarabinh and John, for you guys. And I remember, what was it, a couple of years ago now, 3 years ago now, that John and I were walking through London on the way to like a festival. And then I felt this heaviness of like, I had so many questions, like philosophical questions to ask on the walk. And I just like, first thing in the morning, I opened up a large conversation around like, was it death or something like that? And then I said, hey, John, sorry to bring up philosophy first thing in the morning. And you said it was, well, that's how mornings should start. So, you know, to whatever degree, I'm like vicariously enjoying the morning with you all. It's, you all are friends and collaborators, and I feel like I can trust you all in a very like pertinent way with my work. So I want to start that by kind of like opening up something which I've often tossed around in my head, but, well, not just in my head, but also kind of like just in the process of doing the work. And this comes to some of, John, your more recent work around voluntary necessity. And it has to do with kind of the history of TIAMAT. So when I started doing this, what I was looking for was just like, hey, how do I do actor training outside of like a formal institution? Because that was my background. Like, what other exercises can we play? What other games can we play? And then something happened in the process of that discovery, which felt incredibly real to me. Like, it became less about the acting thing. There was something more important that seemed to emerge in the process of doing that. One could call it like a kind of connection. It was really like, I felt, okay, more connected to these people that were experimenting with kind of theater games with me that I didn't quite feel in like a formal institution, or wasn't as present for me. And as I continued developing that work, and particularly in the past few years, getting to know more of the philosophy and the science, it started to really take a different kind of import for me. Like, oh, we're not just playing around. I'm not just trying to teach people to be actors. Because people coming weren't actors. They weren't interested in doing that. It was like, oh, this is actually kind of developmental. And then after a few years, that faded away. And it was not just about how do I make myself better anymore and regulate my emotions and, you know, communicate what's happening for me. It became much more, to say grounded doesn't feel quite the same way. There's a tonos, to use your term, John. There's like a generative tension between what are we training for, which is something like a connection to something beyond myself, and at the same time also feeling being more fully human, which obviously as we talk more about the advent of AI, that becomes a pressing issue. So what I'm trying to point at is the way in which this work of transformation seems to be transforming. It's growing, it's complexifying on its own, and it's doing that to me as well. Like, I feel that too. And that's where my question of like, what are we actually talking about when we talk about transformation? What is that? So I'm holding some nervousness around this question because it's really big. And I don't expect we get to a conclusion, but I want to toss that out there to start us off. If anybody wants to pick that up.
Well, I guess I'll start. My contributions will be from recent work I've been engaged in around sort of an interrelated set of problems. I think if we want to be using the word transformation in a non-trivial sense, we have to mean something simply beyond learning or simple biological maturation or things like that. We're trying to use, I hope, we're trying to use a word to point to something that's qualitatively different, that we're affording something that might not otherwise happen to people. And because, of course, learning and biological change are inevitable for people. And if we're offering transformation, what are we offering that's above and beyond just learning new skills and so forth? And so for me, as I frequently do, I've tried to reverse engineer this notion around what particular problems are we addressing? And the problems that I key into are posed by some very important thinkers. One is transformative experience. Literally, that's the book there's related work by Agnes Callard, but this is especially the work of L.A. Paul, which is, transformative experience seems very, very difficult to explain because we don't know how our normal modern way of framing things in terms of propositional knowing, we don't know how transformation can occur because when I undergo a major transformation, I don't know who I'm going to be. I'm ignorant of it before I go through the transformation. And I don't know how I'm going to see the world. And yet those are the two things we use to determine if it's a good thing or not. How am I in the world and how am I seeing the world? And so should you do the transformation or not? And this is the problem that L.A. Paul has posed. And I've made the proposal drawn from evolutionary biology that serious play is the way in which we see animals going through major developmental changes, and maybe we could understand a transformative experience as a kind of developmental change and serious play. Because what serious play does is it allows you to take on, at least imaginally, what it would be like and how the world would look when you undergo the transformation, but you're not fully committed to the transformation, so you can keep a foot in both worlds and you can compare them in a reflective manner. And so that's, I think, so one of the proposals I would make is that transformation requires solving the transformation problem, and I think that solved by serious play. The second one is the self-transcendence paradox. This was posed by Galen Strawson, which is Well, let's say it's not just learning, not just growth, and so it can't just be the extension of the self, because if you're just extending the self and growth, it's not transcendence. So if it's something radically other than the self, it's transcendence, but then it's not self-transcendence. It's something smashing into you and overwhelming you. So how do you get self-transcendence? And my attempt to address that has centered around what Ethan has been talking about, which is voluntary necessity. And that's something we can get into, but it has to do with that sense that you have in love and in following a good argument, or being captivated by beauty, that you feel strongly compelled, but you don't feel that it's compulsive loss of agency. In fact, you feel like you're acting freely. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the many different species of that genus are ways in which we feel we're deeply in contact with something that's present and actual to us. So voluntary necessity, I think, is crucial. Then the third one is the problem of strong transcendence that that Greg and I have been working on, which is, do we mean anything other than psychological change with transformation? And I hold it that the philosophical and wisdom traditions that I respect claim, contra modernity, that the transformations that are brought about in people are significant self-transcendence. They're strong transcendence. They're not just psychological change. They make an epistemological and ontological difference. So what is it that's going on in people that brings about that kind of strong transcendence? And that, of course, requires an ontology that's not just a flat ontology, things like that. And we can talk about that. But on the cognitive side, this is all the work I've been doing largely because of the Philosophical Silk Road and the work of Mark Wynne, amongst others, around the recovery of the spiritual senses. And so we as human beings are capable of significant transformation by exaptation. We can take processes that originally emerged in learning and or evolution for sensory motor functions, and we can repurpose them. I'm doing it right now with gesture. We do it with metaphor. We do it in every way we're being imaginal. And so we can exact the sense of sight into insight, noetic vision, that are talked about in many traditions, enlightenment metaphors, awakening metaphors. We're exacting the machinery of vision in some important way, and we're starting to see the world differently, different patterns of salience and sense presence. The hearing is a prophetic hearing. It's the sense of being called, and it's on an exactive continuum from things merely being, and I like the word because it means to call, appealing to us through various degrees of voluntary necessity until people get a pronounced sense of being called. This is the work of Yaden and others, whether it's a vocational calling or it's what they call a prospective epiphany, which is a full-blown sensibility transcendence. And then touch. This is Kearney's work on tact, contact. What is it to people use contact metaphors about moving towards a relationship to what's really real. They're in contact with what's really real. They're conforming to it. And that confirmation, that contact, that touching and being touched, realizing and being realized, seem to be central to how the sacred transforms people, or at least what people are orienting to as something that transcends them and can transform them. So for me, those are the three problems I'm trying to solve: the problem of transformation, the paradox of self-transcendence, and how can we recover strong transcendence by transforming the modernist framework that basically precludes strong transcendence and reduces it to mere psychological transcendence. So those are the three. I know that's everybody else will have a lot more to say. That's my contribution. Those are the three problems I'm wrestling with, and that's what I can offer in terms of what I think we're talking about when we're talking about transformation.
I have to admit, after hearing you, John, talk about that, there are so many questions that come up for me. So I feel like I could just dive head deep, kind of, or headlong rather, into a set of questions and queries and attempts to open this up further. I'm not sure, Ethan, if that's what you desire, or if you have a. So Okay, but then maybe these questions also reveal on a meta level, coming from quite a computational background, I guess.
Yeah.
Part of me has a very strong desire to take concepts like transformation and put them into some kind of to use less analogical reasoning. I suppose analogical reasoning is something I've been working on the last couple of years to dive more into that. But part of me wants to kind of link the concepts and terms that you've just used, John, to things that I can recognize, that I can place more strictly in some kind of category. And I'm going to maybe just try and do that because it's what I can bring from this perspective of mine. But I'm also just curious for your thoughts, right? So one thing, for example, you started with, which immediately my mind was like, oh, I want to ask John about that, is you mentioned kind of transformation as not developmental.
No, I meant it's not just everyday development. I think we can understand it as a developmental stage. I did say that. What I meant was I want a way of, I'm just operationalizing it. If we want this to be specific, have a more specific denotation, I want to distinguish it just from learning and, just the way your body homeostatically adapts or grows or things like that. I want, because transformation just means change of form, and there's all kinds of ways in which we change form. But
Sure.
I want one that we might want to say, and I don't know what the right adjective is here. It has existential or spiritual or sapiential weight to it. That's what I want. That's what I'm trying to focus this on.
Mm-hmm.
That's all
Right.
I was attempting to do. I'm definitely not claiming it's not developmental. I'm not saying
okay. Not just developmental. Okay, fair enough. I think what called me in that point was remembrance also of kind of coming from a Muslim religious tradition, but then also, I guess, having progressed through, in a way, an academic life cycle, kind of even people see this in career change, right? You go from being a student to some kind of active member of a scientific community to maybe a mentor and so on and so forth. But also on the religious side, kind of noting that when you reach adolescence, often the rules around how you mix with the kind of the other sex begins to, some rules might arise around that, or some ideas of modesty and so on that were really common, at least for me in my experience of religion. It really strikes me that transformation for me personally occurred most often when there was a sense in which the environment and the arena I was in, whether that was religious or more kind of scientific or in terms of educational, that I was called to transform by structures that were in place and put in place by the culture around me. And it's kind of like, oh, you're now this age. We're calling you to transform how you relate to other people in your environment, to bear some kind of responsibility for maybe their safety, for their security, maybe for your students, for their education, and the fact that you hold this relative position of power now. And so as a mentor, you can consider what kinds of impacts you can have. So it's interesting. I guess what caught me there was that it feels as if major developmental phases biologically called me at certain points to transform and almost invited me to take part in that transformation. And so did the kind of changes in my position and my relative power or authority that I was holding. So yeah, I'm curious for that was what came up for me, I guess, especially at the beginning of what you described. So I want to share that.
Ethan, should I let Sarabinh speak or should I respond to Naz? How do you want to do this?
Well, I was actually going to bridge off of Naz and into Sarabinh, actually, even though I see you're already muted, unmuted, Sarabinh, because I really kind of resonate with what Naz is talking about, as someone who's been through the acting world. My sense of it is, when I think of transformation, is that, I can no longer be just who I am. The way in which I participate in the world needs to change, and the world is changing, will change differently, right? Or accordingly, rather. So, I can no longer be a 22-year-old Ethan in drama school anymore. I have to be a 70-year-old butler. And there are things that as a 70-year-old butler, I can and cannot do. And I see the world in a particular way, including something as complex as death anxiety. And it stays, like that hasn't left me, right? So there is a permanence to it that I feel. So in that sense, I feel like there is this relationship between the who I am and what the world is revealing itself to be. And so I think, that's sort of where I imagine, like, Sarabinh and I have had conversations about this recently as well, so I can bridge over to that. What do you think?
It's funny, Ethan, because I think you're gesturing with your words to something you're not saying explicitly. I could be off. That is kind of where we landed at the end of our conversation on Wednesday. And as Naz was speaking, I thought, oh, that's exactly like there's a little bridge here between what John's saying and where we were, which is what I want to jump into. I want to point out parenthetically that just intuitively, as I sort of, before I think I even turned off my mic, I sat forward, I put my leg up. John mentioned gesture earlier, and I dropped the sort of like, I'm on a video, and moved into my own body of this is how I think, right? I need to occupy my body in a certain way to think. And I say that in part to say that in all the things, John, that you raised, you didn't talk about body, which I want to bring into this in the middle, as a middle pillar around transformation, consciousness, sapience, et cetera, and just leave it there. All right. I'm not a scientist. And I'm not a scientific discourse person, so I don't think through text quite in the way that John does and Naz does. I do, but differently. And I don't tend to use the same vocabulary. So I was sort of tickled as John started talking because I thought, yeah, the question for me here is just, how is the kind of transformation that Ethan is bringing into this conversation different than change? It's that simple, right? What are we talking about that's not just change? And what does that mean? And I think there's a whole lot of other pieces, some of which, for me, John, spoke to beautifully in your kind of tripartite framing. But I think that when we talk about how is this different than change, the other question for me that is lurking in all of what John said is, what's the kind of self we're talking about? And how is this self that we are talking about and maybe that we're reaching for with the word self different than modern accounts of self? And, that's, when we talk about ontology or epistemology and we, use our terminology that can be very, very helpful for us, in some sense, that's really what we're talking about. What are we? How do we know? What might we be or ought we be or could we be? Is that just one thing or is it varied? And how do we become that? And then there's that just opens up a field of questions, right? Am I something stable to which things happen, or am I something that is continually emerging and only emerges is the happening itself? And how does that change? And can it be, to kind of lean on John's language, engineered or planned for? Are there pedagogical forms for that? And our traditions have them. I think that what you were gesturing to, which really struck me when Naz was speaking, is this question of what structures are in place that call for transformation. And that we're at a point in time where perhaps we have unconsciously been party to the creation of a global, that doesn't mean all, I don't mean all encompassing, but around the planet network of cultural forms that aren't calling forth the kinds of transformation that we need to become whatever it is we intuitively sense we're called to become. And so we're in this intuitive place of we need something that calls forth a different version of ourselves, another mode of being or other modes of being. And we intuit that. And I think, one of my suspicions is there's something to be looked at in that intuition. That there's a kernel there or a seed there, right? How is it that we even perceive that? What's going on there? Because there's sort of a spiraling out and returning in of something that's both alien and intimately familiar. And yet, I think that, Ethan and I came to this question about what's going on around the absence of the cultural forms that make this kind of transformation possible, or when it does happen, that sustain it, which is how we came into this very question, Ethan and Ellie and I on Wednesday. And how do we think about that? Because one of the things that we're observing that I would throw into this sort of kettle that Ethan pointed us to, and I think John began elaborating so clearly and lucidly, is that there are a lot of experiments going on around transformational processes. Some of those experiments have been going on in lineage traditions for thousands of years, changing and transforming. And some are more recently jury-rigged, pulling from some of those, pulling from newer scientific forms or, pieces of thinking or experiencing that emerged in modernity. Some are turning to forms that haven't existed for centuries and are trying to revive them, right? We have all of this at play, and people are going off, let's say, euphemistically going off into the wilderness to engage in serious play. But then most of them have to return to the workaday world, where even if they have either experienced some profound transformation or caught a glimmer of the possibility of one, they return to a world of cultural forms that don't provide for an integration, support, or ongoing transformation of that. Because so many of our cultural forms exist antithetical to that kind of transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were in this place, I think at the end of our last conversation, where we really got caught. And I don't mean like trapped, I mean attracted to, compelled in your voluntary necessity way, John, of thinking, oh, we really, really actually in our broader culture don't have the forms in place that call for the kind of transformation we're talking about. And it might be productive to think about the dissonance between the kinds of transformation people are experiencing that we sometimes poo-poo by calling them self-indulgent or a kind of like workshop capitalism, a kind of consumerist relationship or orientation, a fetish of the experience of transformation that's then cast aside. But maybe it's helpful to think about it more charitably, which is that people are intuitively seeking for something that is needed. They're catching fragments of it. And then they return to a world in which it can't actually be seeded because the fertilizer, et cetera, the conditions aren't right. And so then they go back to seeking for it again elsewhere. And there's that kind of bifurcation back and forth. And I think that, I want to return to, I started by in part talking about the body by suggesting that part of the problem and maybe part of the answers may have to do with how we orient ourselves to the body and what we think the body is and what we are activating, to lean on John's words, sapientially through the body, including our bodies with other bodies, human and otherwise, material and otherwise.
That may I respond now, Ethan, or do you want to?
Everybody's free to respond. You all please have at it. Let it.
First of all, I love this. It's early in the morning, but man, wow. I don't want to try and dominate, but I do want to try and address some of the major points, excellent points made by both Naz and Sarabinh. It's funny because I both expected it, but what they ended up saying was unexpected, which is joyful. Naz, I completely agree that there's ways, and Sarabinh picked up on this very well. There's ways in which, and you used some important language, in which the environment can be structured to call us into transcendence, transformation. And I'm trying to link those two as the maybe in a compressed slogan that carries all the dangers of a slogan. I want to talk about transformation as transcendence, to try and differentiate it from learning and skills and something like that. We can dispense with the term, but I'm just using that as a placeholder. And I think we are called into that, and then we have to ask what's the nature of that. I think the situations in which we are called, I think one of the things your point notes is there's things happening in our bodies sometimes. There's things happening in the environment. There's things happening between them that call us. I would argue that that's ultimately because of the transjective nature of the self. To pick up on the self is dynamic, it's dialogical, it's co-created by the embodied brain, body, right, and the environment, including the socioeconomic and cultural environments, and not just the environmental environment. And so all of that, I think, resonates. I think what people do in those situations is and we do this even developmentally, so I think there's a continuity there. We set up what Luhrmann calls a paracosm. A paracosm is an arena that is trying to basically coordinate modeling between the microcosm of the person and the macrocosm of the culture. And in that paracosm, we have this shared sort of playground, and that's a term that's Jin Sung and I have been using in a recent paper we're trying to get published. We create a playground in which we do the serious play, the paracosmic playground. And one of the proposals is that rituals, insofar as we don't mean them to be neurotic compulsions, but we mean deliberative practices, meaning done deliberately, not with deliberation necessary, but deliberate practices of seeking transformation. I think what's happening is you get serious play in paracosms. What's going on now? As you're concerned about the neuroscience, I didn't go into that because that's not necessarily shared between all of us. But I mean, that's a big part of my work too. It's about how do processes of self-organizing criticality, small world network complexification, couple the brain, the embodied brain, through sensory motor behavior and exactations of that to the complexity of the environment in a way that affords the adaptive flourishing of individuals and groups, because I think groups also form collective agencies. And I just got a paper published, it's called From Flow to Mystical Experience, the entropy fluency hypothesis, in which we try to talk about entropic aspects of brain organization, functionality, complexification. So, I mean, I don't want to burden us on that. I just want to say that I share that concern with you. And so that's the one way in which I make a concession to modernity. But I also take what Sarabinh said very, very seriously. I think, I don't think this it would be controversial for anybody knowing my work. I think that lack of cultural support and affordance for transformation is a big part of the meaning crisis. That's why often we describe the meaning crisis as a wisdom famine, where do you go for wisdom? And I think that's right. And so part of what I think we have to do as well is a deep critique of modernity. What is it about modernity, especially all of the dichotomies, subjective, objective, fact, value, is, ought, mind, body, they all have to be deconstructed. That brings about a radical embodiment as an alternative way of understanding who and what we are, that I think is central to what Sarabinh said about bringing the body in. I think the body offers us two main points. I think the body is autopoietic, which is it is self-making. It makes itself in, from, and to its environment. And I think we have to bring that into any idea we're discussing here. And I think what it's doing is it's always exacting sensory motor behavior into something else when we are trying to transcend. So I think of the self as existing at sort of three levels of that acceptation. There's just our what you might call our organismic agency, in which we're doing niche construction. There's our selfhood, in which we are extending our agency through time and through levels of construal with narrative, and how does that work? And then there's we are the only organisms so far that we can tell make promises, and so we commit ourselves to a normative dimension too, and we're bound to community. We're persons in communities, and so I mean, and you're all saying that's version of Plato. Yes, it is. I get it. But I think it still lands. And so I think the deepest transformations involve transcendence on all of those. There's your agent. You're in a new niche. You're in a new story, and you're in a new community. And part of what Sarabinh is saying is the world isn't giving us those niches, those stories, or communities in any kind of viable way. So that's my attempt to pick up on the very insightful points that both of you made. And I want to turn it back over to everybody. But I think this is rich and wonderful.
I want to make an observation off of actually I think what you're fleshing out there, which is very much the kind of shift that I think Sarabinh is pointing toward, I was gesturing towards. So one of the, I think, it's the first module, technically it's the first module, second module really in TIAMAT X, which is called Self as Process. So what I'm meaning is that there is a kind of dichotomy which underpins the famine that both you and Sarabinh are putting your finger on, right? What I've seen as paramount, absolutely paramount, is to address this standpoint issue. I'm trying to get people to move from seeing self as thing into self as process. If we can make that shift, right, then I think all of the structures that you are talking about, John, start to become affordances in our developmental worlds. But I also cannot get rid of what is ultimately a pain point to me, which is that I see people come into my work and they go back out, right? And the daily life is still seeing them as a thing, right? So there isn't a place for self as process, ontologically speaking, to rest. And I think a lot of that hinges also on variants like, well, how much practice do you keep up, right? Are you in fellowship with other people? Are you continually reminding yourself of oneself as not a static thing that needs to fit a certain way, be a certain thing, play a certain role, but actually dynamically evolving across time all the time? That's the thing that I'm finding very difficult to engineer, for lack of a better term, even though I don't have that explicit intention. But it's very difficult to cultivate a kind of stick-to-itiveness after one has moved from self as thing to self as process. So I throw that out there as a buttressing of your point, and I want to see like also what do you and Sarabinh, what do you and Nas sort of think about this, because it bugs me a lot.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, we have to be careful on the framing of this because there's two potential aspects. So this is just amplification, and I won't say much. This is a perennial problem to some degree. I mean, all the traditions wrestle with this problem. This isn't our unique problem. But nevertheless, given what Sarabinh said and how I would totally agree with it, we might have unique exacerbators of this perennial problem. And maybe we'll take care to make sure we're not, we Westerners, we alone have these, we're not doing that. So there, I mean, this is a perennial problem. I don't know if I'd say all because I haven't surveyed, but many of the traditions that I've talked to worry about this problem. But given that we're in the wisdom crisis, the meaning crisis, the wisdom famine, we might have particular exacerbators of that perennial problem. I just wanted to do that bit of amplification.
I mean, Ethan, I feel like you're just like it's like the house dropping on the witch in the Wizard of Oz, right? My toes are like barely wiggling. And I really do appreciate, John, your last comment, because I think it's to the point, which is to say this is a problem, and then the problem takes on different forms that have different degrees of power or non-voluntary compulsion that they exert on this. Yeah. And I think, I happen to hang out with a bunch of Frankfurt School scholars. So I spend a lot of time speaking with people who really think about this from a particular critical economic lens in terms of economic systems. And that's a global phenomenon at this point. That's not a Western phenomenon anymore. And that's also not to say, as you said, and I think I could like repeat it ad nauseum, it's not just particular to capitalism. It's not just particular to this. You know, I think about Simone Weil's writing on force and the way in which we create structures that existed long, long before our contemporary economic and political systems that turn people into things and function to wildly alienate them from their spiritual capacities. And but the question that I hear Ethan asking is, how do you, which by the way, this is a question that I am definitely hung up on, or in bed with, maybe is the way to put it, continually with respect to thinking about education in multiple forms, which is, how do you basically inject yeast into something so that it changes from the inside out? Right. One way of changing entire systems is to say, I'm going to knock the whole thing down and rebuild it. Well, I can't do that. Or I'm going to diagnose everything that's wrong structurally and introduce all these changes. That can be good when done collectively, and I don't have any objection to work in doing that. But I think there's another question, which is, how do you begin to introduce other elements into a recipe, and I'm a cook, that can become activating agents? And is that possible? And if it is possible, how do we think intentionally about doing it? And so when Ethan, raises what he's raising vis-a-vis TIAMAT, there's these very concrete questions of, how do you begin to take this kind of work, very particularly, like the exact work that he's doing, and begin to think about the practices, the networks, the structures that exist post the workshop itself? How do you begin to create an ongoing, changing in and of itself process that has built into it some of those external calls for ongoing transformation, those structures, rituals, processes, practices, modes of accountability, et cetera, that allow for the ongoing change, but also are ideally crafted in the beginning with a kind of open-ended possibility for their own change and transformation as the community itself develops.
This is really, I mean, I feel almost a little shy to be talking and bringing up some of the points that I'm going to bring up, just because there's so much richness I'm getting from this. There's so much to unpack. But I can only pick one thing at a time. So very quickly, I want to say thank you, Sarabinh, for demonstrating how to change one's physical form and take on a more loose stance to thinking, because I also want to do that now myself. And I want to also play a little bit with an idea with all of you that I've been experiencing myself as someone who's been doing the workshops with Ethan, who's then have my kind of, in some ways, my career at the same time unfolding in front of me. And trying to keep alive some of the practices. And I want to bring up a couple of thoughts, and I'm so curious for feedback. So the thoughts the thoughts ran through my mind something as follows. I really appreciate the notes on how we have to be so, how the present times and maybe the worlds that we live in are calling all of us to see in what way are we not being encouraged and called to transformation. And what is it about our environments right now that are not fulfilling that need? Because I felt that deeply at some point. I think when I started the containers and my first TIAMAT practices, it was actually from a place of feeling like, for me personally, it was that I finished my formal education at a higher educational institute. I had my PhD. I had my PhD at the time. I'm starting a career, and it felt to me at the time like, until now, I was on a journey of change that was an agreement between me and all the people around me, where everyone kind of had agreed with me, you are being educated, so you are allowed to change, you're allowed to grow and develop. And then there's kind of a dropping point where it's like, oh, now you've entered what we call a career. You should now do things. You should now in some ways perform. That's how I heard it. That's how I experienced it. And it felt as if the road in front of me was no longer one where I had the encouragement to say, hey, you can grow and change and transform more and kind of discover yourself in a way. I think that kind of mantra was really alive during the period of time when I was studying. And suddenly it felt like I was now kind of, about to enter my 30s. The world wanted to see me as someone who had transformed into an adult and should now settle down. And so where is now the home that we expect from you, the family we expect from you, the career we expect from you? And I felt almost stuck in a way. Like I don't feel like I'm ready to stop changing. And for other people to be able to look at me from a distance and be able to tell all of who I am from my credentials on a piece of paper. I don't feel like I'm there yet. Why is this? Why does it feel like this is the expectation on me? So I just want to say, like, for me personally, I could really experience that moment. And I had that moment happen a few times through my studies, but I was also, privileged to study for quite a while before I really had to consider career. So I wanted to kind of
now, just before you go on, can you unpack that? Because I think that's a really pivotal moment. What was the affect for you? Like, what was your sense of orientation? What was your affective state when you were in that place? I think. Sorry, I know you have other points, but that's such a excellent opportunity. Sorry, I don't mean to sound exploitative, but it's excellent opportunity to get into the depths of something.
Sure. No, I'm very happy to try and I'll try to do this as honestly, kind of as clearly as I can as well, because it's complex, right? And affect. How you experience something. So it's got so much to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's still to wander between affect and attention and orientation. I'm trying to I'm just giving you a grab bag of categories. I'm not trying to pin you down.
I think for me, I experienced a sense of loss. That was something that was very alive for me.
Right.
A sense that I had been in a space where there was not it almost felt as if during my studies, I was seen as something with potential. That feels right. Mm-hmm. It's almost like I was seen as a person. My mentors did treat me as a person almost exclusively. I'm very grateful to the mentors I had, but I was seen as a person with a lot of potential. And it seemed as if to kind of at a certain point suddenly that I was no longer part of the category of people who were seen with huge amounts of potential, and was seen more as a category of person who was seen as kind of who should produce things now. That sounds very capitalist or so potentially, but I don't mean it that way. I don't mean it to have kind of an impact on economic thinking or so, but I really mean that people were expecting output from me, where previously they were not worried about the outputs I produced, but were excited to see the ways in which I changed. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, it left me with a real sense that I didn't feel complete. That's the term that comes to mind. I didn't feel as if I was at a place where I was happy to say, yes, I am no longer going to move and change. And yes, I know enough about myself and the things that I want. I think, in fact, the biggest question that came to my mind at the time is, but wait a second, I still don't know what I want. Mm-hmm. And now I'm supposed to stop exploring or something like that. And that question has troubled me a lot for some time. It's like, but wait, I'm supposed to know what I want now. I think that's what I'd internalized, is the sense that if I'm at this position in life, I should now know what I want and where I'm going, because now I'm not supposed to be exploring anymore.
So I want to, this is good, like concrete, this is good. So let's put Nas here. I'm trying to do an Aristotelian thing here. Here's Nas, he represents one thing, right? A loss of like the sense of potential and the intrinsic value of process and transformation. Is that fair, Nas? Am I getting it?
Yep.
Now we all know either therapeutically or pedagogically or in other ways, people who have the excess, and of course our culture puts a name on it because our culture does that. Peter Pan, and of course we have a myth around this. The boy who doesn't want to grow up because all the beautiful potentials, and to actually grow up is to kill some of those choices and decision to cut. And we know people that, so let's say you're experiencing the deficit, the loss of potential. We can also think about people who are trapped because they are awash in the excess of potential and they're unwilling to give it up. and I'm wondering if we're also starting to talk a little bit about maybe, this often happens when you go concrete, are we looking for a virtue in here of somewhere? What is steering us between this Scylla and Charybdis? We shouldn't feel at a loss and unhomed and disoriented, Naz, but we also shouldn't be flitting about without a shadow in Never Never Land forever and ever and ever also. So this is frequently, this is what I turning to the concrete often does. Is it like, sorry, we don't have to take that up, but I'm proposing that as something we could explore.
I just want to say very quickly, John, even the two kind of separate you mentioned that how do we not feel at a loss and unhomed in a way? But I also feel like one can feel if they have too much potentiality, they can also feel at a loss of what to do.
Yes,
and not homed in something.
Right. That's right. And so I'm saying, sorry, I was trying to point out so he's in Never Never Land, which means he's also homeless. Right, with the lost boys, right? So I'm trying to say the difference between them isn't loss or aporia, but it's that one side can be right. No, I still need to hold on to potential. I'm trying to make it as concrete as and another is I can't let go of potential. Right? That's how that's what I'm trying to say. Is that okay? Does that land for you, Naz?
Yeah. So no, I more wanted to point out indeed the similarity of the issue on both ends of that spectrum, and indeed the middle as being somewhere to land. I don't know what to say as to the virtue yet. I'll have to give that some thought.
Yeah, I don't know what the virtue is either. I'm just trying to pick up on an opportunity here.
So, I don't know. I don't have an answer in terms of naming a virtue, but I think it's interesting even that John has helpfully, except I'm going to like poke a big hole in it, but I think it's a really helpful move, brought up the Peter Pan versus the adult, because, and I think actually I have no hole to poke because you're pointing to both of them as a Scylla and Charybdis.
Yeah.
Which is the problem, which is the potential versus this kind of completed adult. And, what comes to mind is a comment that she probably makes it in many of her works, but that Bell Hooks makes in her little volume, I think it's called Teaching to Transgress. And she just very simply says that teachers ought to be self-actualized. And by that, she means something along the lines, as grand, I think, actually something along the lines of a Jungian individuation. She's saying that teachers, the ideal teacher, should be someone who is involved in the process and in it, not just contemplating it, in the process of I don't want to quite say unification, but a engaging the world from a dynamic place in which the body, mind, for her, I think body, mind, and soul are in a live and aware dynamic relationship with each other. And that is always an ongoing process because that is a dynamic relationship. As John has said, it's transjective. And so the moving from the child to the adult is from potential to a place of dynamic integration, ever developing integration and engagement that is aware of that process and can meet people through that process in order to bring others into that process. And so that doesn't relinquish potential. In fact, it's predicated on an ongoing potential, but a transformation in the sense that I think we were trying to get at the beginning has happened, such that the being that is now engaging with those potentials isn't in potentia in the same way that an immature child developing student is. The being that's engaging with potential has moved through sort of spiraled circuits of that to become some other kind of being with awareness to that process, and has a sort of humble self-direction in it, which might come back, John, to your sense of it is a being that understands voluntary necessity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it is a being that, and when I say understand that, I really mean that it's not a cognitive understanding.
No.
And so when she's talking about body, mind, and soul, we're not talking about, what one of my roshis would refer to as the land of conceptuality. We're not talking about someone who's just perceiving the world through senses that they experience as located above their shoulders. We're not in the anthropology of Plato's Timaeus. No. We're talking about someone who knows has formed themselves, or is formed in perceiving through different sort of sentient centers in their being and engaging with the world in that kind of dynamic, evolved, subtle bodily form. And that then necessitates, I think, the ongoing development, Nas, that you're talking about. But we're talking about a kind of being that isn't recognized by, and I think the economic critique that you were sort of brushing aside as necessary, is not recognized or cultivated by the work world, technological world sort of structures that we live in.
That last thing you said.
No, you go on, John. Go on, John. Yeah.
Well, the last thing Sarabinh said, again, this is all just the language of proposal. I was thinking about, first of all, I loved what you said, that ability, that sensibility transcendence that makes one able to sense voluntary necessity, or to participate in voluntary necessity. There's something that gem. Because you can see that's Plato's problem. He's trying to figure out, as an educator, and he fails with Alcibiades, of course, like Socrates fails with Alcibiades, famously. So and then when you said that, I was thinking, when you went into the economic, how we're forced economically that, and this may go towards Nas's sense, right? I don't know, but I'll try. So there's a distinction, of course, between enkratia and sophroson, where enkratia is I'm forcing myself because I have to produce. I have to produce a product that is socially acceptable. That's exactly, and this is how we're taught, and this is how, the capitalist system. Control yourself so you produce, right? And whereas sophroson, and now I've been looking for a way of talking about that, because it's a kind of weird virtue. It's a meta virtue, but the sense of, I used to call it being tempted by the good, but I like what Sarabinh said. It's that sense of like that one is, I don't know, like magnetized into voluntary necessity. One is drawn into by and into and through voluntary necessity. And that's the way. This is a really great proposal, Sarabinh. That's the way you steer through the Scylla and Charybdis of I've lost potential and I've become a mere cog in a wheel. Kratia, forced, or Peter Pan, I'm just flying about endlessly, because Peter Pan obviously does not have sophroson. I'm not saying anything I don't think you haven't said, Sarabinh. I'm just trying to say that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing, and you may not want to take this up, but I'm hearing an excellent proposal for what sophroson is and how it's integral to what we're trying to afford here.
And I think it's really hard. I mean, I think that, most of us, and I would put myself squarely in this, you only begin to realize that's where you're trying to get by crashing into Scylla and Charybdis.
Yes.
In wretched ways, sometimes in life-altering ways, sometimes multiple times, until you begin to figure out how to right the ship.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, we could spin off into the sort of, well, maybe this is the time, and Ethan, it's a question for you, and talking about this vis-a-vis TIAMAT, which I'm not familiar with. I'm familiar with the dialectic and dialogo stuff, of course. The process of moving from thinking that being a virtuous person is being a kind of goody two shoes, to put it in a I think, an apt caricature, to beginning to explore that being a virtuous person is first someone who begins to recognize that virtues are powers with which we engage the world and that we can choose them. And then moving into a space where that process starts to become intuitive. And that involves cracking through a lot of accretions, layers of what we take to be ourselves, breaking them apart and reforming. And that process of cracking through can be a very messy process. Or it is anyone who has either been through or accompanied people who've been through analysis, or accompanied people who've been through or has been through themselves major emotional, spiritual, life, grief, crises, traumas. And, buried in there are layers and layers of burdens and pains and confusions. And so, my understanding from these conversations with Ethan is that what he's been trying to do is pull in strands from a variety of practices and modalities and ones he's birthed himself to create a playground for that work to take place in very intentional but intensified process.
I want to add something to this because I similarly had insight, John, when you were just talking. I think you formulated my work as you usually do incredibly well, Sarabinh. I'm trying to set up like optimal constraints by which one can find a home in the process of development and transformation. And something that has come up, particularly around sort of folks just meeting resistances, for example, in this developmental process, has been exactly what you had named, John, with Ankratia. So I said this, I think, on the call on Wednesday, Sarabinh, that somehow we have part of one of the issues that I have with the way that our culture perceives spiritual practice or spiritual transformation is it has a form. And until I am perfectly that, I am not spiritual. So the way that I tend to see that come up is we have conflated acceptance for repression. And it's the weirdest thing because I'll hear someone say like, I'm not Zen enough to do this yet. Right? And I go, you finally misunderstood Zen. And that's tricky because I'll often ask them like, okay, then what is enough? Because if you're saying I am not X enough, you must know what that standard is, right? And if you can explicate what that standard is, then you can say, okay, it's enough or I'm not enough. How can you make a self-assessment without knowing what that is? And that throws them into all kinds of like, but the point here being that like, when I'm thinking of folks who are perhaps not as well versed with the philosophy, they're not going to come into a workshop and quote me till it. They're not going to come in with a Jungian understanding of individuation, right? Or worse, they come with a malformed understanding of Jungian individuation. Or people come in with a sense of, hey, I am basically no different from an AI, right? Like these are people that I want to help. And as a teacher, and I say this because we're all teachers in the room, to adult students, right? There is a powerful like ethical imperative that I feel that one I cannot run away from, because I can't just tell them grow up, right? I can't just tell them be more spiritual, and I can't tell them be Zen enough. None of those work. And it's a light pushback, I think, to what you were saying, Sarabinh, which is I'm not entirely in the camp that it has to be a violent crash into something. I think that the teacher's role and you named this also, is somebody who can exemplify being on that journey at all. You know, I think once we confuse a teacher as being the finished product of what we're supposed to look like, we're lost in looking at self as thing rather than self as process. Then we're screwed. So I'm curious, like, how do we take this idea and apply it to the spirituality of transformation, and how does that fold into, perhaps more personally or professionally, our endeavors as teachers? Not even just teachers of spiritual practice, teaching history, teaching philosophy, teaching AI and computation, teaching itself independent of the subject matter. But that's where, like, I feel fired up, or I feel called to question.
Ethan, I just want to clarify one thing and then sort of pass this on. But I don't mean to say that one needs to crash into skill or accruedness. I don't think that that's ideal, but it often happens, and that's often part of the journey. And I think that for those in this work, it's important to realize that you may be dealing with people who have or who do in the context. I'm tickled by the way in which your closing comment about the teacher actually brings back to the question that you and I were sort of raising with John some weeks ago when he was speaking about whether the teacher needs to actually be wise, and sort of pushing against the idea that the teacher needs to be fully Zen or fully enlightened, or, you know. But so I would say, like, I want to temper my comment in some sense, or make it clear, and yet I'm also just raising the concern that when you are doing this kind of work with people, you don't know what's going to get opened up. And so having the capacity to work with that and having the forms in place to work with that is really important, which is what I understand you to be doing. I mean, I haven't been through it, right? But I understand that. And I was trying to gesture to that. And I think that, you know, it also comes back to what you were saying too, which is that there is an importance of recognizing that everyone's an adult in the room when everyone is an adult in the room. And that there is a kind of responsibility there of a thinking through of what that really means when engaging in this kind of work. On all sides, including the participant side, that they're coming in to open.
Go ahead, Nas.
I was just going to jump off this point.
I think there's feedback coming from your computer, John. Sorry, just to point that out. I've just been hearing it.
Feedback?
Yeah, is that there for you guys too? Just before we, yeah.
What happens when I mute the mic?
I think it's fine. Yeah, it works. Yeah, this is great. Now there's no more feedback. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, go ahead, Nas.
No worries. I wanted to jump off the point that Sarabinh just mentioned, to say that, like, having been a participant in containers in the last couple of years, I think Sarah, you're 100% right to point out that this kind of altercation with something that is kind of a depthful realization can be kind of world changing for a person in both a positive sense, but also with potential for, like, a serious amount of work that needs to be done afterwards to fully integrate it, and that can be a challenge that people should know that they are taking on. But as you mentioned, as adults, but I have to kind of, having said that, the reason I wanted to give that as preface is to say that some of the most impactful outcomes, I suppose, or long-term, the most long-term impacts of the practices that I've done have been ones in which I was doing we're playing in a practice, right? But doing that very seriously with very personal material. And in some ways, the more personal material that I was able to find the courage to bring to the practice, the impact of that was unmeasurably longer and more deep. And one of the things I was very glad for, Ethan, in the containers I've taken part in with you, is that there was also then a space and quite a thoughtfulness around how the practices were constructed, such that there is something big can come up, and you can choose. You honor yourself, and you choose to bring it into the space. And then there is also often mechanisms by which we can then kind of bring that down and let it land gently, and then hold that together, and maybe discuss also and unpack the impacts that one person's share had on others, so they can feel supported, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to say, I guess, that indeed, there is also a privilege to being treated as an adult in the room that I experienced, which was I can choose the depths to which I feel that I can handle bringing something forward, but then I can also, in that sense, affect my journey onward to a kind of a more significant degree if I'm ready for it.
Sorry, I had to turn the mic on to speak. I hope that's okay. I want to respond to the problem you posed, and I hope this picks up on what Sarabinh and Naz were saying. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, this is a question we keep coming back to. Ethan and I, you talked about it a lot. Sarabinh, you and I talked about it too. I call it the problem of gurufication. Like, you shouldn't present yourself as the wise one or the sage. And I was thinking about what is, and so when I talked to Bishop Maximus about voluntary necessity and what's at the heart of all this, I proposed to him that that's what he meant by faith. He doesn't mean by faith belief without evidence or reason. He means that sensibility that calls one into sophrosyn. And so I was thinking that maybe the teacher is faithful in the sense of trust and troth and truth. They all have the same etymological origin. We're true to something, we're troth to it, we trust it, and we exemplify that kind of faithfulness to something rather than holding ourselves out as the sage. We are the faithful. We are the faithful, and this is obviously an image from the Bible. We're pilgrims on, and we're faithful to it. And our faithfulness can help other people to become faithful, rather than saying, I'm going to enlighten you, or I'm the guru, or I'm the teacher. And so, again, and this goes to Sarabin's point, notice the struggle we have around this, because modernity has codified faith, post-enlightenment, as belief without belief, not that full-bodied thing Sarabin's been talking about, but as belief without evidence and argument. And that's not, we're trying the original meaning, beleben, to give your heart to. And I think what the teacher has to, this is what I've been concluding sort of pedagogically, is if the teacher is going to draw people into sophrosyn, the teacher's virtue for doing that specific thing, for me, I'm proposing that it's this kind of faithfulness, that we are faithful to something. We're not experts, we're not sages, we're not enlightened, but we're not just novices, because we have come faithful, like you're faithful to a partner, you're faithful to a pilgrimage. And so I just wanted to propose that as what it is we are, because I totally agree with the only way to do this is we have to exemplify it. But the danger of exemplification is I'm the guru. That's what I'm exemplifying. I'm exemplifying to you wisdom. And I thought that's really dangerous. So how do we get the exemplification without the gurufication? And so this is, I'm proposing this notion of faithfulness, truthing and trothing and trusting, rather than claiming a particular status. That's so.
Yeah, that sounds like the virtue that lands in that gap. And I say this because I feel like I feel a little bit guilty, because it's like in the people know this well. Yeah, I'm in good company, right? I'll complexify something, and I felt like something got dropped in the process of that. Like we were on an explication and something got dropped with sort of what I come in with of like, hey, what are the problems that actually exist here? And I see us sort of coming back around to them. But I have faith that we can. I have faith that we can. Yeah. So I want to name that. Sarabinh, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm now curious, what do you feel has still been dropped, Ethan?
The sense of the cultivation of the sense of voluntary necessity, right? That it's coming around to sort of like Mark Wynn's work, that kind of stuff. How do we cultivate that sense? One. How do we home it, right? As practitioners, how do we home it? And then as teachers, how do we set up the constraints such that the student is neither stuck in the gurification problem and goes, you have to just teach me how to do that, but actually walks away with the constitution that allows them to continue honing that and cultivating that sense in perpetuity, independent of the teacher. So that's how I'm drawing them together as it stands now. Is that coherent for you guys? Like, is that making sense?
It makes sense to me. And a number of things come up, but then I don't know how to place them. So it feels like I have a sense of where we're going, but I'm struggling with the outline in some way. I'm just going to give a couple of thoughts because I hope they might help. And these also are active reflections of the ways that practice have impacted me in ways that I've tried to turn that into a process and keep it alive. And I hope that also might be helpful. For me personally, also especially as a teacher, I feel very lucky to be a teacher because I feel as if I get so many opportunities to be called and to notice moments of indeed voluntary necessity. And to me, my sense really is that having taken part in some practices and trying to keep them alive within within all aspects of my life, that voluntary necessity, it's almost, I mean, Ethan, you say this sometimes in the workshops, and I really appreciate it, which is you often say, for example, take for granted that you will find something curious. So you'll have some curiosity about something someone says. So you take for granted that you will X, Y, Y, Z, Z. So effectively approach situations with a sense that you're taking for granted that something is there and leaving yourself open to it if it is, when it is, and almost always is. And for me, these moments of it, again, it feels like being called to take on some kind of a responsibility or to affect the trajectory that a student is taking. It generally feels like if I take for granted that voluntary necessity is always present somewhere, I will find it. Does that make sense?
I tend to say take as granted.
Okay. Yeah, take as granted.
For granted. William.
Okay. Okay. Take as granted. Interesting. It's the first time I've got that. But does that make sense?
That's William Desmond's distinction, just to give proper credit. That's William Desmond's distinction. The conversion from taking for granted into taking as granted.
As granted. As granted. Nice.
This is really, I love this because what I wanted to raise with relationship to this is, again, in some sense, it comes to our anthropology, right? Our sense of what a self is and how we develop and how teaching and transformation happen. But, you know, we haven't in this conversation at all. And we don't generally culturally talk about transmission, which I think is a huge loss. And I think the shift from take for granted to take as granted moves into that place, you know, and I'll speak a little bit from my own lineage at this point, which is very autodidactic, not super verbal, and one that is really grounded in and springs from learning body to body with other people. And in having a teacher, it's not that your teacher tells you what to do, or you just aim to please your teacher, or that you're trying to learn by absorbing, by noticing experientially in your body something that the teacher is inhabiting, something that's moving through them, and practicing alongside them till you begin to feel it moving through you, and exploring that in yourself and working with that and continuing that development if it works, and if it doesn't, you cast it off. And so this practice of thinking about how you learn, again, it comes back to a different, experience of interoception and proprioception, a different exploration of embodied learning and embodied cognition and embodied, maybe sapience is the right word, but awareness. I think that might get to some of what you're talking about, you're gesturing towards, Ethan, around the problems, both the problems with gurification, as John's talking about, and this question of how we think about the cultivation of the teacher-student relationship. That it is experiential, it's exploratory, it's experimental, and that agency, the primary agency for the student, lies in the student. And that's part of what has to be cultivated over the early years of formation, which is an exploration of their own wildly varied internal transjective sensorium, which is really far more different, I believe, from person to person than we acknowledge and then we work to cultivate in our current forms.
I just want to say that was beautifully said. That was beautifully said.
Yeah. I think we're also at our time, so I want to follow in John's tradition. So give my guests the last word. What are you all walking away with? How's it been?
For me, there's been a lot of jewels here, a lot of gems. I'm glad this is recorded because I want to go back to it. But I just wrote down, and again, sparked by Sarabinh, we're trying to move, is like we're trying to help people move from sentience to sapience in some fashion. And also there's about, not in Kratia, but Sofrasun, and we're not the gurus. Like I said, we're faithful. But I like the idea that Sarabinh just did about faithfulness involves transmission. This is Plato's realization in the seventh letter. You talk, but you have to live with somebody until the spark catches, right? That kind of thing. That embodied aspect. This could be a noxious metaphor, but it's almost like we're faithful enough so our students catch something from us, rather than we're giving here, right? I've noticed that. I've noticed a species of that genus that I think Sarabinh has put her finger on with the notion of transmission. I've noticed that teachers who get into the flow state, often their students will catch that and get into the flow state with them. So there's a concrete example. And notice that we're emphasizing catching a process much more than catching propositions or products in an important way. So that's what I'm taking away from this, and that's really, really powerful and beneficial.
So at the end of this conversation, I'm very grateful for having gotten to spend the time with you all. It's really been lovely. What I'm taking away from this, I suppose, is a real awareness of that Sofrasun that we've been talking about, and also a sense that, and there's something that I think I'm going to kind of poke my head around for the next couple of days probably, is the sense that, if we go down this gurification route, all I've done is move the goalpost at which the person feels like they've reached the end of their transformation to there. Say, hey, no, it's okay. You started your career, it's fine. Now become a guru, then you can stop. And once they get there, then they're like, what now, right? And I don't want that for anyone. And so there's a way in which I guess what I'm taking away is like, okay, the route through that is to, and also I guess the excitement that I have is that now in the place that I'm at, I feel as if, though I've reached my maybe developmental kind of adulthood, the growth that I can make is continuous and continually opening up for me. And that this is not a road with an end, not a road with a destination, and that's a good thing. Something like that. Thank you.
I think I said my piece, Ethan, so I'm just going to say thank you. This was such a delightful way to spend my Saturday morning. Really, really wonderful. And to Naz and to John, like, just what a joyous way to go into the weekend. And I just feel enriched and enlivened. And there's something so wonderful about just dropping in. We're kind of covering not quite the four corners of the earth, but you know, a good portion of it for four people, and to feel like there are it's like a sodality, right? That we're all working away at these questions in our lived lives. We're working on these on different parts of this planet home, and that is a beautiful, beautiful truth to share in.
Yeah, I wanna thank you all. Like, I feel incredibly grateful to have friends who are teachers and teachers who are friends. I learned so much from all of you individually because I spent so much time with each of you. But as like together, it's just wow, fantastic. Like I feel a bit overwhelmed actually. Yeah, I've wanted this to happen for a long time, and I'm so happy that it has. Thank you all very much. To everybody who's watching, thank you all very much as well. We will see you next week, which is interesting because next week we are going to be with Taylor Barrett, who will help us run TIAMAT, and he's also runs Awaken to Meaning, and he's one of my best friends, a long-time facilitator of transformational practices. Everyone here knows him well. As well as Dr. Brian Brown from the University of Exeter, who just so happens to be my PhD supervisor, and is a scholar and a cultural historian, and deeply, deeply embedded in the world of cultural laboratory practices, the kind of embodied training that Sarabinh was brought so forefront into this conversation. We'll be in with him next week. And as well as Sam, who is also another one of our Spire aspirants, who has taken theater games and practices and moved them into a corporate sphere, right? So he's very much in that world of folks who are perhaps in that space of people who are, self as things, right? Or sit in that kind of structure. And so I think there's a lot of continuity from this conversation into next week's conversation. If you're watching, I hope you guys would join us for that as well. So thank you all very, very much. Please check out TIAMAT in the show notes, and we will see you all next week. Ciao. Bye-bye.